first of all, I disagree with your argument that it was false pretenses.
It was false pretenses.
So if somebody said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, it was a false pretense.
It was a false pretense.
So Ted Kennedy, when Ted Kennedy said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction the day after the vote in Congress, he was laying out a false pretense. When President Clinton, Secretary Clinton, Vice President Gore, now Vice President Biden, John Kerry, John Edwards, when all those Democrats stood on the floor of the Senate, Jay Rockefeller, and said Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction and we support going into Iraq to disarm them of those weapons, they were lying to the American people?
I think they were.
Well, good. At least I finally found a Democrat who's willing to admit that they lied. I don't think they did. I think they went on the basis of the best available intelligence they had. The world felt that he had...
They never attacked us, though. The war was based on... You
know what?
made the American people think that we were going to war because of 9/11.
No, we weren't. No, we did not. With all due respect. No, we didn't. The United States received a resolution from the United Nations authorizing the use of force. The United States Congress, in a bipartisan vote, authorized the use of force. And why? Because after 9/11, we realized we could no longer wait until dangers fully materialized with attacks on the homeland. We had to deal with people who represented threats as he represented a threat. He represented a threat. Think about this. During the decade of the 90s, he ignored 16 resolutions of the United Nations which called upon him to abide by the agreement that he made in the aftermath of the first Gulf War to cough up his weapons of mass destruction and account for them. He was thumbing his nose at the United Nations. And why? Because he felt that the United Nations was weak and the West was weak and that they would lose attention, they would lose interest. He was perverting and undermining the oil for food program, and what would happen is we'd go away and he could reconstitute these programs. We now know three things about him. We know, first of all, that he wanted us to think that he had these weapons. He felt it was a deterrent to our activity. He felt he had a freedom of action within the region because we'd be afraid to take him on because we thought he had biological and chemical weapons. Second of all, he wanted his neighbors to think that he had them because it, again, served as a deterrent to them. It kept Iran on one side and Saudi Arabia on another side, and it made him a big man in the neighborhood. Third, he wanted his own people to think he had them because he thought it was an essential element to keep himself in power. That's why on the morning that we took Baghdad, his commanders on open air are talking to each other saying, when do we get permission to deploy the weapons? These are his own commanders. They think they have biological and chemical weapons available to use. Now we know he had them. We just don't know what happened to them. Some of them may have gone to Syria, some of them deteriorated, some of them we did find 500 tons of uranium. We found chemical and biological weapons that had deteriorated by the hundreds and thousands. We also know this from two reports by Kay and Doeffler, international weapons inspectors. One thing we know was that he was keeping together the dual-use facilities to reconstitute these programs once the West lost interest. He was literally diverting tens of millions of dollars a year from the oil for food program to keep together the chlorine plant, for example, outside of Baghdad that produces more chlorine than the entire country of Iraq needs, and yet for which there is no export market. What does that mean? Why is that important? Because if you want to make a chemical weapon, chlorine gas is a vital precursor chemical. We also know that he was keeping together the engineers and technicians and weapons scientists, literally again by diverting tens of millions of dollars a year from the oil for food program, so that when the moment came and the West lost interest, when we stopped flying airplanes over the no-fly zone, and when we sort of lost interest in the United Nations and turned into a dead letter, he could reconstitute those programs. No, the United States and the world community and leaders, both Democrat and Republican, believed he was both a threat and that he had weapons of mass destruction, and that it was in the national security interest of the United States. It was, after all, in 1998 that President Bill Clinton signed a bill to set as the policy of the United States a policy of removing Saddam Hussein from power and regime change in Iraq. It was the right thing to do, and the world is a safer place for having that mass.